She thought she could block my access. Now she pays me to use the road. But let me tell you how a simple parking dispute turned into the most satisfying real estate revenge story you'll ever hear, and why my neighbor Karen now writes me a check every single month. It started 3 months ago when I moved into what I thought was my dream house on Maple Street. Beautiful colonial, perfect yard, and a long driveway that connected to the main road through what I assumed was a shared access point. The previous owner, Mrs. Henderson, had lived there for 40 years without a single problem. She warned me about only one thing before I signed the papers: watch out for Karen next door. She's particular. I should have paid more attention to that warning. Karen Mitchell lived in the house directly adjacent to mine, and our properties shared this narrow strip of land that served as the access road to both our driveways. For 40 years, Mrs. Henderson and Karen's family had used this road without incident. It was wide enough for 2 cars to pass, lined with old oak trees, and honestly, it was kind of charming. But Karen had plans. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning when I was leaving for work. As I backed out of my driveway, I noticed Karen standing in her front yard, arms crossed, staring at my car like I'd personally offended her ancestors. She was a woman in her early 50s with the kind of haircut that screamed, "I want to speak to your manager, you know the one." Blonde, aggressively layered, defying both gravity and common sense. I waved politely. She didn't wave back. The next morning, she was there again. Same position, same hostile stare. This time, she was holding what appeared to be a measuring tape. I slowed down as I passed and rolled down my window. "Good morning, Karen. Beautiful day, isn't it?" She looked at me like I'd just asked her to donate a kidney. "You're driving too fast," she snapped. "This is a residential area." I glanced at my speedometer. I was going 8 miles per hour. "I'll be more careful," I said, because I'm a reasonable person who believes in neighborly peace. That was my first mistake. By Thursday, Karen had escalated. I came home from work to find orange traffic cones placed strategically along the access road. Not blocking it entirely, but positioned in a way that made driving through an elaborate slalom course. A handwritten sign was zip-tied to the first cone: "Slow down. Children at play." I looked around for these alleged children. Karen's kids were grown and moved out. My closest neighbors with children lived 2 blocks away. The only living creatures I'd seen playing on this road were the neighborhood cats and an occasionally confused squirrel. I moved the cones to the side and parked in my driveway. Within minutes, Karen emerged from her house like a suburban tornado. "Excuse me," she shouted, marching across the road in her garden clogs. "Those cones are there for safety." "Karen," I said, trying to keep my voice level, "there are no children playing here. And the cones are making it impossible for me to get to my house." "Well, maybe you should have thought about that before you moved here," she snapped. "This used to be a quiet neighborhood." I blinked. "I've lived here for 2 weeks. What exactly have I done to disturb the peace?" "You drive too fast, you park that ridiculous car in your driveway where everyone can see it, and you clearly have no respect for property values." My ridiculous car was a 3-year-old Honda Civic. In silver. The most inoffensive vehicle ever manufactured. "Karen, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'm not trying to cause any problems. I just want to get to my house." She planted her hands on her hips. "Well, I want world peace and $1 million, but we can't all get what we want, can we?" And with that philosophical observation, she stomped back to her house, leaving me standing in the road wondering if I'd accidentally moved into a reality TV show. The next week, Karen unveiled phase 2 of her master plan. I came home Monday evening to find a wooden sawhorse blocking the road completely, with a sign that read, "Road closed for maintenance." Karen was in her yard, watering plants that clearly didn't need watering, watching me with the satisfied expression of someone who just won a chess match. I got out of my car and examined the sawhorse. It was homemade, painted bright yellow, and absolutely not placed there. by any official maintenance crew. Karen, I called out, what's this about? Oh, that, she said, with exaggerated innocence. The city called and said they needed to inspect the road. Could take weeks. I pulled out my phone and called the city's public works department. After being transferred 3 times, I finally reached someone who could help. Road maintenance on Maple Street, the woman on the phone said. No, sir, we don't have any scheduled work in that area. If someone's blocking a public access road without authorization, that's actually illegal. Would you like me to send someone out? Yes, I said, loud enough for Karen to hear. I would love that. 15 minutes later, a city truck pulled up. The driver, a middle-aged man named Bob who looked like he'd seen every possible variety of neighborhood nonsense, took one look at the sawhorse and shook his head. Ma'am, he called to Karen, who had suddenly become very interested in her rose bushes, you can't block public access roads with homemade barriers. It's not a public road, Karen replied, not looking up from her flowers. It's a private drive. Bob pulled out what looked like a property survey map. Actually, ma'am, according to county records, this is a designated easement for access to both properties. You're required by law to keep it clear. I watched Karen's face go through several interesting color changes, from pink to red to a shade of purple that probably wasn't medically advisable. That's impossible, she sputtered. This is my property. Bob, who clearly enjoyed this part of his job, spread the survey map on the hood of his truck. See this blue line here? That's the easement boundary. It runs right through what you think is your land, but it's actually designated for shared access. Has been since 1967. Karen stared at the map like it was written in ancient hieroglyphics. But I've lived here for 12 years. No one ever told me about any easement. Well, ma'am, it's public record. Should have come up when you bought the house. Bob folded up the map. Anyway, I need you to remove this barrier immediately, or I'll have to write you a citation. Karen reluctantly moved the sawhorse, shooting me looks that could have melted steel. After Bob left, she marched over to where I was standing. This isn't over, she hissed. I'll find a way to make you regret moving here. That's when I realized Karen wasn't just particular, she was completely unhinged. And that's when I decided to do something that would change everything. The next day, I called my lawyer. So let me get this straight, my attorney, Janet, said over coffee. Your neighbor is trying to block your legal access to your own property, and there's an established easement that's been in place for over 50 years. That's right. And she's threatening to escalate the situation. Janet smiled in a way that made me think she'd dealt with Karens before. Well, here's something interesting about easements. They can be owned. What do you mean? Right now, it sounds like you both have easement rights, meaning you can both use the road, but neither of you owns it. But easements can be purchased, transferred, or in some cases, abandoned. If someone wanted to buy the actual ownership of that easement, they'd own the road? Essentially, yes. The original property owner who granted the easement or their heirs might still hold title to it. If you could track them down and purchase it. My brain started working overtime. What would that mean, practically speaking? Well, if you own the easement, you could still be required to allow access to properties that depend on it. That's usually how these things work to prevent people from being landlocked. But you'd have much more control over how it's used, and you could potentially charge fees for access rights. I nearly choked on my coffee. You mean I could charge Karen rent to use the road? If the easement agreement allows for it, and if she has no other reasonable access to her property, then yes. She'd essentially become your tenant for road access rights. That afternoon, I went to the county courthouse and requested all the property records for our street. It took me 3 hours and 2 trips back to get copies of everything, but I finally had the complete history of the easement. The original property had been owned by the Morrison family from 1923 to 1967. When they subdivided it to create the 2 current lots. They retained ownership of the access road but granted easement rights to both properties. The Morrisons had sold the easement to the county in 1985, but then the county had quietly transferred it back to private hands in 1998 as part of a budget-cutting measure. The current owner of the easement was listed as Morrison Family Trust. It took me another week to track down the Morrison family. The original owners had passed away, but their grandson, David Morrison, was living in Arizona and managing the trust. When I called him, he was surprised to hear from me. "You know, I'd completely forgotten we still own that," he said. "My family hasn't lived in that area for decades. The trust just gets a tiny property tax bill every year for it, maybe $40. Honestly, it's more paperwork than it's worth. Would you be interested in selling it?" "For the right price, sure." "What did you have in mind?" I'd done my research. Similar easements in the area had sold for anywhere from $5,000 to $15,000, depending on their length and importance. But David Morrison didn't know that. "How about $10,000? I offered. "For that little strip of road?" "Seriously? It's become a source of conflict with my neighbor. Having clear ownership would solve a lot of problems." "Well, if it's worth $10,000 to you, then sure. I'll have my lawyer draw up the paperwork." 3 weeks later, I was the proud owner of the easement that provided access to both my driveway and Karen's. I celebrated by having a professional surveyor come out and place official boundary markers along the entire length of my new property. Karen watched the whole process from her window, and I could practically see the steam coming out of her ears. But I wasn't done yet. The next step was the most delicious part of my plan. I had Janet draft a formal notice to Karen, informing her that the access road was now under new management, and that continued use would require a monthly access fee of $200. "Is this legal?" I asked Janet as we reviewed the document. "Absolutely. She has no other reasonable access to her property, so she can't be denied the right to use the road. But as the new owner, you can charge reasonable fees for maintenance and use. $200 a month for a private road access is actually quite reasonable. What if she refuses to pay? Then you can restrict her access and she'll have to find another way to get to her house. Which, looking at these property maps, would require her to build about 300 feet of new driveway through the Hendersons' old property, assuming she could even get permission and permits." I hand-delivered the notice to Karen on a Friday afternoon. I rang her doorbell and waited, listening to her footsteps approaching. When she opened the door, her expression went from annoyed to confused to absolutely furious in about 3 seconds. "What is this?" she demanded, reading the notice. "It's a formal notification that I now own the access road. You're welcome to continue using it for the low monthly fee of $200. Karen's face went through that same color-changing routine I'd seen before. "You can't do this." "Actually, I can. I have a deed and everything. Very official. This is harassment." "No, Karen, this is business. You wanted to control who could use the road. Now someone does control it. It's just not you." She stared at the notice, reading it over and over like the words might change if she looked hard enough. $200 a month. That's insane. It's actually quite reasonable for private road access. I looked into it. I'll fight this in court. You're welcome to try. I've got a team of lawyers who specialize in property law, and all my paperwork is in order. But Karen, let me ask you something. How much do you think it would cost to build a new 300-foot driveway through your backyard? I could see her doing the math in her head. A new driveway would cost tens of thousands of dollars, assuming she could even get the permits and permission from neighboring property owners. "This is extortion," she whispered. "No, this is capitalism. You taught me about property rights, remember? Well, I bought some property rights of my own." Karen slammed the door in my face, but not before I saw something I'd never seen from her before, genuine fear. Over the next week, Karen tried everything. She called the city, the county, the state highway. department, and probably the FBI for all I know. She even tried contacting a local news station, claiming she was being harassed by her neighbor. But every official she spoke to told her the same thing: the easement transfer was legal, and as long as I wasn't denying her reasonable access, I could charge fees for use. She also tried to find another way to access her property. I watched from my window as she stomped around her backyard with a measuring tape, trying to figure out if she could build a new driveway. After 2 days of this, she seemed to give up on that idea. Finally, on Thursday morning, I found an envelope under my car windshield wiper. Inside was a check for $200 and a note written in Karen's angry handwriting: "This is under protest." I deposited the check that afternoon. But Karen wasn't finished with her protests. If she was going to pay to use my road, she was determined to make the experience as unpleasant as possible for both of us. She started driving as slowly as humanly possible down the access road, maybe 2 miles per hour, revving her engine unnecessarily and honking her horn at random intervals. When she passed my house, she would roll down her windows and play music at maximum volume. Her preferred genres seemed to be death metal and what I can only describe as angry bagpipe music. I responded by installing a speed bump exactly halfway down the road, right in the section that was most clearly on my property. It wasn't high enough to damage any reasonable vehicle, but it was definitely noticeable. Karen's car made the most satisfying thunk sound every time she drove over it. She also started having visitors, friends, relatives, delivery people, solicitors, and in one memorable case, what appeared to be a mariachi band, who all just happened to need to drive down our shared access road at peak traffic times. I responded by installing a gate at the entrance to the road with a sign that read, "Private road, access by permission only." Karen had permission, of course, but her parade of random visitors did not. The first time one of her friends encountered the locked gate, I was working in my yard and got to watch the entire drama unfold. Karen came storming out of her house, gesticulating wildly and clearly explaining to her friend about the injustice of the situation. Her friend, a reasonable-looking woman in her 60s, listened for about 5 minutes before throwing up her hands and driving away. Karen marched over to me. "You can't lock out my guests." "I'm not locking out your guests. I'm controlling access to my private property. If you want to have visitors, just let me know in advance and I'll make sure they can get through." "That's ridiculous. Karen, did you or did you not try to block my access to my own house with traffic cones and sawhorses?" She glared at me but didn't have an answer for that. "Tell you what," I continued, "I'll make you a deal. I'll give you a gate remote so your legitimate visitors can access the road. All I ask is that you use it responsibly." I could see the internal struggle on her face. She wanted to be outraged, but she also wanted the convenience of not having to coordinate with me every time she had company. "Fine," she said finally. "But this is still harassment." "No, Karen, this is customer service." 2 months later, our relationship had evolved into something resembling a business partnership, if business partnerships typically involved this much passive-aggressive behavior. Karen paid her monthly access fee on time, used her gate remote responsibly, and had mostly stopped trying to make my life miserable. Mostly. She still drove unnecessarily slowly down the road, but she'd stopped with the loud music. She still glared at me whenever we encountered each other, but she'd stopped making actual threats. It was progress, I suppose. The real victory came when I ran into Mrs. Henderson at the grocery store. She was the previous owner of my house, the one who'd warned me about Karen in the first place. "How are you settling in?" she asked. "Any trouble with Karen?" I grinned. "Actually, Karen and I have worked out a very satisfactory arrangement. She pays me rent now." Mrs. Henderson nearly dropped her shopping basket. "She what?" "It's a long story, but let's just say I found a creative solution to our access dispute." Mrs. Henderson started laughing, really laughing, the kind of deep, delighted laughter that comes from 40 years of pent-up frustration. "Oh, my goodness," she wheezed. "I should have sold you the house years ago. As I drove home that day, using my own private road that someone else was paying me to maintain, I reflected on the lessons I'd learned. Sometimes, when faced with an unreasonable person who wants to control something they don't actually control, the best solution isn't to fight them, it's to actually take control yourself. Karen had wanted to dictate who could use the road and how. She'd assumed that her wishes were more important than property rights, legal agreements, or basic neighborly courtesy. She'd tried to bully me into accepting her vision of how our shared space should be managed. Instead, she'd taught me that sometimes the best defense is a good real estate purchase. Every month now, when I receive Karen's check, I'm reminded that some problems can't be solved with compromise or communication. Some people will only respect boundaries when those boundaries are legally enforced and financially painful to cross. But here's the twist ending that makes this whole story even better. Last week, I received a phone call from David Morrison, the grandson of the original property owners who sold me the easement. "I've been thinking about our transaction," he said. "And I'm curious, how's that neighbor situation working out?" "Very well, actually. She pays the monthly fee without complaint now." "Good, good. Listen, I've been going through more of my grandfather's old papers, and I found something interesting. It turns out the Morrison Family Trust owns quite a few small properties in your area. Old easements, utility rights of way, things like that. Most of them are just costing us money in property taxes." My heart started beating faster. "What kind of properties?" "Well, there's a storm drainage easement that runs behind several houses on your street, including your neighbor's backyard. There's also an old utility easement that controls access to the power lines serving that whole block. And there's something called a scenic preservation easement that apparently gives the owner the right to control any modifications to the front facades of 4 houses, including." I heard papers rustling, including 412 Maple Street. That was Karen's address. "David," I said carefully, "would you be interested in selling any of those easements?" He chuckled. "For the right price, I'd be happy to get them off the books. They're more trouble than they're worth to manage from Arizona." As I hung up the phone, I looked out my window at Karen's house. She was in her front yard, planting new flowers and clearly enjoying her Saturday afternoon. She had no idea that her peaceful gardening was about to become a whole lot more complicated. But that, dear friends, is a story for another day. For now, I'm content knowing that Karen has finally learned the most important lesson about property rights: it's not about what you think you control. It's about what you actually own.